Joe Rogan is the biggest podcaster in the world, but he's a terrible example. Let me tell you why. We know that there are more podcast listeners than there are Netflix subscribers, but your Rogans, your Stephen Bartlett's, your Tim Ferriss's, all of these examples, even Call Her Daddy coming up from nothing, they're still not the ideal example. What you need is a proper podcast format to explode your show when you don't have an audience, and this is it.
Okay, but let's maybe take a step back and let's talk about the different types of podcasts out there. Obviously, the big, huge...
Let me pause right here before we jump in. This is Oana. She had me on her podcast. This is the most tactical podcast advice that I could possibly give. But just so you know, by the end of this, you're going to know the exact format that you can use to blow this up. Okay, let's get it. I came in, right, is the standard interview show. And so I think I'm seeing a trend change here in terms of from the interview to the solo to the, solo is actually really hard and intimidating, to then the co-host. I would say that co-hosted podcasts are the new interview podcasts. Why did that happen? Well, everybody went out to do interview podcasts and everybody made the same show and they just called it different names. And they had the same guests on and did essentially the same interview. There was no segments. It was just like the tell me about yourself. That's what I call that show, right? The opposite of this, where it's like, no, let's stay on track and let's hone in on these actual specific things, right? So I think the interview show was super popular, but the change that I saw was that change to co-host and also solo. So if we go from there, right, we have the interview, we can put that on the shelf. Then we have the solo, which is essentially like you're doing a YouTube channel at that point, right? Like you're sitting in front of the camera, you're talking, it's very editing focused. Unless you have hundreds, thousands, million followers, whatever, you're going to that content's going to have to be quite different than the norm to stand out, right? Because it's hard to listen to just like watch somebody Andrew Huberman style, right? The reason that Huberman is successful is because he was in the media beforehand, right? Just for an example, like he already had the fan base. If he would have done that 20 years ago, or like Gary did, right? Like Gary didn't have millions of views talking about wine, right?
Right, but then at some point you grow and then you have huge resources to put into the content, right? You have a huge team. I mean, I know he has 29 people that just focus on his content, which is crazy, So like the rest of us don't have that.
Yeah, 100%.
So like being realistic.
So that's I guess the only point like that I have to make on that is just like don't look at those people and be like, that's me. Like, no, it's not. Like, it's okay. It's good that it's not. Like, we have to start where we can start, but it's like looking at Joe Rogan today is not going to help you. Looking at even Stephen Bartlett today is probably not going to help you. Sure, listen to his podcast about how he grew it. Take notes. Like, I've been taking notes on Tim Ferriss's podcast since 2017, right? Like, but you have to take what can apply to you. So we have the interview style, we have that solo style where if you do a Huberman like that, you have to spend the 12 hours to do that research to make that episode, right? And that's why it's great. Then we land on the co-host, which I think is the magic. I think that is we're going to be seeing a lot more of those. We're already seeing more of them. But one way to do it in a business context is have your interviewer and then your talent, right? So have somebody there to feed the person. And I'm working on a hip hop podcast right now with a pretty famous rapper and producer where, we brought a co-host in, or his team brought the co-host in for him to do this. And you can do this on a small scale, though. You don't have to be some famous person. What you do is you give that person, you throw the person the ball, and then they can dunk it, right? And that's what you want to do. And then they can dunk it 8 times, and then you clip the best 3, and then boom, there's your podcast, right? That's just one way to do it. But I really think from the interview to then we saw the solo, but it's like, that's really hard and intimidating and awkward, to now like the sweet spot is the co-host, no more than 2 to 3 people, occasionally bring in a guest, right? But then that guest is definitely going to have hopefully an audience that they can bring to you, right? And I can go deeper in all these tactics, but like those are the types that I'm seeing in terms of format wise, and also seeing shorter. I'm seeing shorter and I'm seeing longer, so I can go on both ends. But like, I think, the attention span thing is something we can talk about too, as to why.
Yeah, I think length is an interesting topic to talk about real quick because, of course, like you know, you look at the Diary of a CEO and it's like 1 hour and 20 minutes, but it's the Diary of a CEO.
Yeah.
And it's Stephen Bartlett with like huge names, right? Like when we start talking on a podcast, what's the ideal, you know, timeline that we should be looking at? What's an ideal length of an episode?
I do believe the Hormozy quote of, you know, nothing is too long, it's only too boring. But I also think that Andrew Huberman is boring sometimes. But I'm also I'm also listening to it, right? So it's like it can be boring and great, you know. So like we're kind of in the weeds, right? The answer I always give for this is 30 minutes is the average podcast length. I can't tell you how long it should be or short it should be. I'll give another example, which is when I create a solo podcast episode, I will record 20 to 30 minutes. 5 to 10 tops will become the video version, highly edited, and then 10 to 20 max will be the audio version, edited as well, but edited differently. So that's just 2 examples there, which is like the median length is 30 minutes. But then we can get into the avenues of video version versus audio version and, you know, getting into that domain as well. So the moral of the story here is to have a co-host if you want the cheat code, right? Have somebody that can either interview you, you interview them, or you bounce ideas back and forth and they complement your personality. If you want the full interview with all of the tactics, I'm going to put that link in the description of this video. So just go ahead and click on it over on Oana's channel. All right, I'll catch you next week.